Good evening, everyone. Hopefully, our audience is populating. I'm Dr. Wendy Wilson, and I serve as the Vice President of University Relations, Chief of Staff, and Director of our Centers for Diversity, Inclusion, and Social Equity. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to our second installment. We have an amazing series with none other than Miss Chelsea Miller, and she's a noted social activist who has done some amazing work, has an amazing body of work all across the country, but certainly within the East Coast region. And so we first engaged with her for our honor and celebration of the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King last month. And she is joining us this evening to further that discussion with specific emphasis on mobilizing and social justice reform and engagement in the digital space. And so I am going to hand this amazing platform over to none other than our SGA president, who will be serving as our host and moderator for this evening. She did an outstanding job last time, and so we had to extend her the invitation to come back. She graciously accepted, and I cannot think of a better person to hand over this evening's conversation to than none other than our president of our Student Government Association body, Miss Aaliyah Johnson. Miss Johnson, who will then be followed by Miss Daisha Shavers, who will be managing our Q&A for this evening. And so, ladies, without further ado, I'll hand the platform over to you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Wilson. Welcome to the part 2 of the 3-part series, Adjusting Social Activism. If you all missed part 1, that's simply okay. We're glad to have you with us. Tonight's topic is organizing the digital divide. Please feel free to submit questions in the chat box below. I have the pleasure of introducing our lovely guest, so I'll go ahead and dive in. A Columbia University graduate, Chelsea Miller is a 24-year-old Brooklyn native and leading voice in youth activism. Chelsea is the co-founder of Freedom March NYC, a youth protest and policy group on the front lines pushing for reform across the nation. She's addressed thousands of people in speaking engagements that includes the Madison Square Garden, Yale University, and most recently, the March on Washington. Her work has been featured in New York Magazine, Forbes, Vogue, CNN, and BET. In 2016, she worked in the Obama White House as one of the youngest interns on criminal justice reform and urban economic opportunity. She is the co-founder and CEO of Women Everywhere Believe, Inc., which is a national organization training women and girls of color to be civic and corporate leaders. Her work has been recognized by elected officials and national organizations alike in the space of activism and social entrepreneurship. In 2020, Chelsea was named by the city and state of New York the 50 most powerful people in Brooklyn. So, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome our lovely guest once again, Ms. Chelsea Miller.
Okay, so let's hop right into it. So I'm so excited, first and foremost, to be here this evening with all of you to unpack, especially in the midst of Black History Month, even though we know Black History Month is really Black History Year and Black history is world history. But I think that there's something to be said in being able to come together and use this month as a time to really reflect on everything from activism to social entrepreneurship to how all of those intersect in the digital age and what has been coined, I guess, as the digital divide for the sake of this conversation, which to me is always very interesting because I think that there are two conversations that tend to happen. One of the conversations is around how social media is used as a tool to build community, but in that very same breath, the ways in which we engage oftentimes can be detrimental to our sense of community and understanding of identity. And so how does all of that play a part in what next looks like as we think about in the next 5 to 10 years? How do we talk about activism? What is the impact of activism? What is the impact of social change? And how do we show up for movements? So a little bit about my journey into activism, even though you all did an incredible job of introducing me. One of the things that I say is that the accolades are one aspect of it, the work is another. And it's so important to be intentional about understanding what the work looks like and why it is important to do some of the behind the scenes, and also demystify, right? What do we mean when we talk about activism? What do we mean when we talk about engaging on social media as a way to bring about change? And so I will take it a little bit back to talk about how Freedom March NYC came about, which is a youth-led civil rights organization that focuses on training young people across the country on how to organize nonviolent protests. We did so much leading up to the presidential elections and getting young people out to vote, voter registration drives, training other young people on how to organize voter registration drives in their communities throughout the country, and then also the importance of civic engagement and policy change. And so there are so many different ways that my work intersects with everything from what's happening on the national level. One of the things that we're working on is pushing for the Biden administration to give a seat at the table to young Black folks and organizers who made such a huge impact at this election. And truth be told, when we talk about all elections and the Democratic Party and who shows up, it's really important to be intentional about keeping those promises to the communities that have elected you. And so that's a lot of what we do on the national level, which is very parallel to the work that we do on the local level as well. In New York City, actually, we have the mayoral race that's coming up. And so that's going to be really important for us, especially as Freedom March NYC has a policy platform that focuses on advocacy work. And so all of that probably sounds like a lot. And what does it look like in practice? And so I actually have a video, and this video came out this past week, so very timely. And it's a video that ABC News actually reported on Freedom March NYC. And I think that it's important to share. It's about 4 minutes. And so I don't know if it makes sense to just send the link to you, Aaliyah, and then you share it on your screen, or if I should share it from this end. So let me know what works. But before we go into the video, I just want to say that when we talk about what happened after the George Floyd protests, it's important to know that this is rooted in history. And a lot of the things that often comes up is, how is this generation different in the advocacy tools are used? How has social media enabled advocacy to look different? And one of the things that I always say is that social media is a tool, but it is one of many tools. And so always keep in mind that even before social media, there was community. Even before social media, there was strategy. And so really what it comes down to is, how do you continue to build community, and how do you continue to build and develop your strategy as an organizer, as an activist, as someone who wants to create impact in the world in a way that ultimately lets you use social media without social media consuming you. And one of the key things to do that is really centering the narrative and centering your message. So something to leave you all with before we get into the video. And I see that I was just made host, so I'm guessing that's my cue that I can share it and it'll be fine. So.
There was a George Floyd before George Floyd. There was an Eric Gardner before Eric Gardner happened. These issues have been happening inside of this country for years.
We had to let leaders know who had labeled Black Lives Matter protesters as thugs that we're not going to be intimidated by the very systems that seek to silence us.
Now is the time where we're trying to make sure that everyone realizes that our lives matter.
And so we're going to make it clear whose streets, our streets.
Freedom March NYC really came about just two young women who wanted to make sure that our voices were heard.
Everyone was still talking about the looting and the rioting, and the centering of the message of the movement was being lost.
No one knew what to do besides just go out there, scream Black Lives Matter, and figure out how they can be a part of something.
Nyla and I messaged each other, said, do you know of any organized protests?
And we decided, like, why don't we just organize our own march?
Nyla and Chelsea ended up organizing a massive protest on the 99th anniversary of the burning of Black Wall Street.
It really started with maybe a small crowd. Then at the very end, there were probably 800 to 1,000.
we realized that it was important to have something that was a little bit more organized.
We went in the streets, we knew what we had to do. And after that, people were just figuring out, what are you guys gonna do next?
Today is just the beginning because we have over 400 years to reckon with.
From there, we made an Instagram page, we made a GoFundMe, we decided to establish a youth-led civil rights organization. We also had to make a policy platform. What do we want our organization to stand for? What are we fighting for?
Voter registration, civic engagement initiatives,
ending qualified immunity, getting police officers out of classrooms.
We give back to the community. We make sure that if they don't got us, we got us.
We connected with State Senator Kevin Parker. We told him, this is our policy platform, how can you help us? And we have some bills that we're excited that will most likely be introduced this year.
We will continue to amplify the voices of Black women, and we will continue to make sure the Biden administration keeps the promises they made of working towards racial justice.
Tonight we protest, tomorrow we organize.
Chelsea's my blood sister. Naila, she's watched me grown up because her and Chelsea went to college together. So to be out there and putting my all with them, it's just so amazing.
As her big sister, I need to set an example for her of what it means to stand on the right side of history. She is a force to be reckoned with, and I'm proud of her and her journey. Naila and I have known each other for years, and it has only been fitting, all of the incredible work that we've been able to do, and it's been incredible to see her leadership journey as well.
I think that my driving force is my mother. I was always being taught that I need to speak up for others, and she was never silent about any mistreatment.
She was actually a social worker, so I was inspired by that to continue to be involved in my community.
And I was raised on the fundamentals of protecting and making sure that I'm supporting other Black women.
My family always instilled in me the importance of knowing your history, but also fighting for others. I had my first action in 5th grade. We didn't learn any Black history, and also MLK Day, the school didn't do anything, so I led a protest with other students in my class, and we held up signs, and then the next year they changed the curriculum.
So next for Freedom March is continuing to grow and train other young people to know that their voices are needed.
And we will ensure that the mission of this march is not in vain.
We're trying to inspire the next person who's going to take this country into their hands and really change it.
I was a part of the final intern class of the Obama administration, and one of the things that I learned from Obama was leadership is about being able to see hope and understand the power that is in the people. So I've taken a lot of what he's left us with into my own leadership. And so we will continue working towards racial justice within this country. And when the cameras turn off, we will still be here. The question is whether or not you'll be paying attention.
So that was a video that came out this past week highlighting the work of Freedom March NYC, particularly with Black History Month coming out. And one of the biggest things that I would say that the video really highlights is the fact that ordinary people, when building community, can do extraordinary things. You didn't just see me in that video, you saw also my co-founder, and you saw our lead organizer, Nia White, and you saw what it looks like to be on the front lines. And it's never just us, right? It is always other people. It is always community. It is always allies. It is always this idea of how can we be stronger together. And so when I think of organizing in the digital age and taking a step back from what that conversation really means and looks like, I want us to make sure that we are grounding this conversation in the reality that everything that we do is about how we can do it as one. How can we mobilize and think through what next looks like? And so being on the front lines and doing the work in social entrepreneurship, you learn a lot. One of the things that you learn is the importance of strategy. And so I want to spend some time really unpacking that and some of the strategy that went into being able to really grow Freedom March NYC and what were the tactics that were used. So when thinking about what happened around May 30th last year, which May 30th was the 99th anniversary of the burning of Black Wall Street, there was a narrative that was circulating on social media that was talking about the looting, in the rioting, but no one was really talking about why the looting and the rioting was happening in the first place, right? There was this hyper emphasis on all of the property that was being damaged and the ways in which folks were expressing their anger without an intentionality of where that anger was coming from, and how do we make sure that we center that in the dialogue. And so across social media, as we were seeing this narrative that was shifting, we decided to create a centralized message that other folks could get behind and understand and pushing about change. And so we created a flyer, and you all saw the flyer in the video. It was a very simple flyer. It just had the time to be there, where to meet us at, and Freedom March NYC, which actually wasn't the name of the organization at the time. That was literally what we were calling the march. And the reason why we included Freedom March is because in the 1960s, as some of you may already know, there was a campaign called Freedom Summer that Martin Luther King and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as well as their other organizing cohorts, joined forces and actually traveled from the North to the South to organize voter registration drives in the South to get Black voters out to the ballot. And so for us, it was really important that as we were thinking and reckoning with this idea of freedom, what does this freedom actually mean? And what is it grounded in? Because we know that ultimately we are reckoning with a country that's history was not grounded in this idea of freedom for all. When we talk about the fact that we currently are on stolen land, when we talk about the fact that Black folks were initially seen as property and then moved to 3/5 of a human, and then we entered a period of Jim Crow, right? This constant battle of trying to prove, right, this idea of freedom and who it belongs to and whose right and ultimately birthright it is. And so it was really important for us to reimagine what freedom looked like and also ground it in a history that we can not only be proud of, but also speaks to our humanity. And so that is why we pulled from Freedom Summer, and that's why we called it Freedom March NYC. With the understanding, of course, that Freedom March NYC is connected to a national conversation. And one of the things about New York, because, you know, a lot of folks have either visited New York before, or I don't know. There's a lot of history there, I guess, about New York as one of those buzz cities in the US that when things happen here, people pay attention. And I would say one of the biggest reasons for that is also because the media hub. We are one of the main and central media hubs in the nation, right? When you think about major news outlets, when you think about messaging, a lot of times the central locations are in places like New York, DC, etc. So it was very important for us to keep that in mind, that a lot of folks were coming to New York as far as press in the midst of this pandemic and racial justice uprising, trying to figure out, what is the story? What are we telling the world? Everyone was paying attention, but they didn't know what they should have been paying attention to. Also keeping in mind that our president at the time was putting out tweets about New York City, right? Saying that the mayor needs to get the thugs and the hoodlums under control, and that he was going to send in the National Guard to New York City. So all of these things were the realities that we were grappling with in real time as we had to make the decision to go out there. This was before there was a curfew in New York. Literally 2 days after, a curfew ended up being in place, or roughly 2 days after. I can't remember, because I'm going to be honest, I didn't follow the curfew because I was organizing and I was outside. But one of the things that we did tell folks when we were protesting was saying we may be out past the curfew. You know, there's legal aid that you have to make sure that you're working with on the ground. You have to make sure that you're taking into consideration safety, as well as the fact that some folks can't afford to get arrested, right? Maybe because they have families, or because they have prior arrests or whatever interactions with the system that makes it something that perhaps they should not be doing. And so all of those things go into account when you're organizing. And one of Freedom March's, I guess, strengths at the time, and still is the fact that we do put our protesters before anything and the safety of our protesters. And so we do try our best, also keeping in mind that we are going up against a police state and a body that is definitely robust, because NYPD is actually the largest police union and entity within our country, and I think arguably the world. You can look into that and definitely drop it in the channel if I'm wrong about that. But it's massive. It's massive. The budget is massive. The equipment and the weapons and all of that is massive. It's a force. And so for us, it was really important that as we were going out there, that we kept that in mind. There were people who were saying that, don't go out, you're going to get maimed with rubber bullets. Don't go out, the KKK is coming to town. And I don't know if you all could hear it in that video of the first night of us being out, but there were actually police choppers in the air as we were marching to our destination, demanding the release of protesters. And so there was a lot that was happening. It was definitely a time where it was uncertainty. You didn't know what was going to happen when you went outside. But what I will say is that in doing that, and in so many other young people coming out and doing that and organizing and showing that there is a different narrative that is worth being told, so many other people in New York started to organize within their own communities. So many other young people across the country started organizing. And so it is really important that we cannot underestimate the power of a few people being able to create a ripple effect. We cannot underestimate the ability to create change, because when we had initially wanted to go outside for the 90th anniversary of the burning of Black Wall Street, we didn't necessarily intend that we were going to create our own march. The only reason why we did that was because we couldn't find anything else that was happening that day. And so for us, it was recognizing that there was a need for something and answering that need. And in fact, if you also go back to that flyer, you'll see that there wasn't necessarily anyone's names on the flyer, because there was a danger in really identifying with something, because, the police were on social media tracking different things that were happening. And so we wanted to keep it as discreet as possible. And nowadays there's no hope of doing that, because everybody in New York knows who Freedom March is. And I'm just happy that we still get to wear masks. So at least I can kind of be incognito when I go places. But yeah, that's a conversation for another day. Anyways, so all of that to say that when we're talking about social media, I want us to be very intentional about what our strategy is for that, right? We posted the flyer at 12 p.m. and by 8 p.m. it became the largest nonviolent protest to take place in New York City for the 99th anniversary of the burning of Black Wall Street. And because of the fact that when we were on social media, so many people were asking us, what's next? So many people were trying to figure out what was happening and how can we continue to stay involved and show up. We didn't leave the front lines all of summer 2020. We continued to organize and mobilize. Another thing that I want to talk about with social media as we kind of get into the story is the importance of knowing what to say and being ready for what to say. And what I mean by that is a lot of times, and this is me being young as well and kind of being introspective, but a lot of times we demand a seat at the table. And then when we get to that table and someone asks, okay, well, what do you want? We're like, well, now that I'm here, I didn't think that far ahead. And so it's really important that when you ask for something, that you are very clear about what it is that you are asking for, and you are ready to show up, not just for that moment, but for a movement. And so what happened was that after we had made it clear that we were Freedom March NYC and we were not going anywhere, we organized a GoFundMe to raise money to turn ourselves into a sustainable youth-led civil rights organization, which includes a budget, right, for an operating budget for everything from programming to equipment that we needed on the front lines to being able to pay organizers stipends and everything else in between. to be able to organize out in Louisville, Kentucky, and do work leading up to the Georgia runoffs. Like, all of these things require funding, right? And so it was really important, especially as we saw that there was a divide in funding that was reaching the front lines, and a lot of the funding was going to legacy civil rights organizations and not necessarily touching young people, that we were intentional about making sure that we were that conduit to being able to do so. And since then, we've been able to pay organizers, youth organizers on the front lines who need money for rent, who are experiencing homelessness. We've been able to pay to support mutual aid efforts throughout New York City and different things of that sort. And that has been possible because of our ability to be that conduit. Another thing that I would say is that when we were outside, one of the things that we made clear was our demands. We said that we needed to amplify our message, we needed to be sustainable, and we needed everyone to amplify the voices of Black women. And we created an infographic, and that infographic went viral, and folks started to share it and circulate it so that people had a very clear understanding of what it was that we were asking for. And so in all of this, I hope one of the biggest things that comes out of it is the importance of having a central message, especially when we live in the digital age. Why? Because the digital age is essentially a microwave culture, right, of instantaneous moments, hashtags, and then it repeats, right? So something is trending, it stops trending, something else starts trending, something is relevant, something goes viral, right? This week it was Gorilla Glue that was circulating for the past 2 weeks. Now everyone's paying attention to what's happening in Texas, right? And then it's similarly in the next week. Does that mean that because it stops trending, this is no longer important, or this is no longer relevant, or this is no longer impacting people's lives? Absolutely not. There is not a direct correlation between what is trending and what is important. Let's be very, very clear. But the nature of it is that the algorithms ultimately are in a way that it creates an environment where everything just comes and goes so quickly. And so for us, as we were in this moment, we were realizing that everyone is paying attention to what we are saying. We have to be very intentional about the asks in that moment so that we could do the work long term. And so that's why it's important to have a strategy. That's why it's important to understand what social media is, right? Because we could have easily said, wow, all of these media outlets are paying attention. This is great. Like, we're across all of these platforms. What do we want to say? I don't know. We just want to talk about X, right? And it's like, okay, well, yes, this is important now, but how is this going to prepare us for tomorrow? And so that was what we were thinking about. And that's how we ultimately determined our messaging and tied it into the movement. Another thing that I want to spend some time talking about, aside from the importance of strategy, is also the very real reality of the toxic nature of the digital divide. And I think it's very interesting that we even call it the digital divide, because as I said earlier, I think it's this interesting dichotomy of absolutely a divide, but also I think unity in some aspects of being able to build community. That's definitely worth talking about. But yeah, so on the topic of what does it look like when we talk about self-care, before we get there a little bit, I did have a few other points that I wanted to run through. And I know that we are running out of time, so I will try to make it as quick as possible. But one of the big things that I want to talk about is the importance of combating misinformation and also centering the narrative, which we spoke on. But combating misinformation is so important. We are in a misinformation age. We are in an age where there are so many things that, again, ultimately become viral. And just because something is viral doesn't make it true. And so a lot of times what we see is that people with large followings are able to attract mass audiences that ultimately sometimes aren't necessarily being given the correct information. And so it's so important in this digital divide era, which as much as we think that, okay, we're on social media, we're on here as a way of leisure activity in a lot of cases. In most cases, in the same way that you are on social media for leisure, there are folks who are out there intentionally creating messaging to target you, right? Because you fall into a particular audience, you fall into a particular demographic. And so thinking about how can we reach someone, especially at their most vulnerable, Because when you're on social media, you're not thinking through the lens of someone is trying to reach me. Whereas I'm from New York City, so I'm on the subway, I'm always alert. But chances are most of us spend more time on social media than we do on a subway, than we do transporting from one place to the other. That is our safety web, right? In our minds, at least, because we build communities that oftentimes we miss when there are things that are taking place on social media that's destructive to the communities that we're trying to build. And so be very intentional about messaging, be very intentional about language, fact check the information that you are getting, understand that there are folks who literally have budgets, right? And have directives that are geared towards shifting a narrative, because that's really what it is. It's about shifting the narrative. Another really important thing that I want to talk about is trust. When you think about social media, when you think about the digital age, a lot of what we've been able to do when you think about impact has been grounded in this idea of trust. The reason why so many folks came out to Freedom March NYC was because they trusted, right, that this was an organization, this was a march that ultimately would serve the interests of the community. And so when you think about the digital age, I definitely encourage all of you to think about how you operate on social media, how you operate within the lens of digital advocacy, but also how are you building trust within your community? How are you building trust as a way to let people know that you are aligned with their interests, or that you ultimately are really thinking about and reckoning with a lot of the conversations that are happening in the world and what that looks like for you. So these are just some things that, initially come to mind. I would also very quickly say, and this is where I want to do the pivot and spend some time on, that digital advocacy is one tool, but it is not the full scope of what activism and what social impact looks like. And I know a lot of people don't even consider themselves to really be activists, right? And so I will say social impact, because really that's what it is. And that looks different across so many different industries, fields, communities, etc. So on this topic, I would say that as much as I am giving advice on what we talk about when we mean digital advocacy and unpacking that in different tools for strategy and leadership, I would say that there are also a lot of people who do not engage with social media. There are a lot of people who perhaps aren't comfortable with social media. And so in that way, when we are living in a society that puts this emphasis on influencers and leadership, and this idea of you need to be an open book for the world in order to create impact, I want to dispel that altogether. And I want to say that even in the midst of a digital age, you are absolutely at liberty to have your boundaries. You are absolutely at liberty to set your own pace of what your leadership looks like and define that for yourself. And if that means that you are not the person that's on social media and you're not a great graphic designer and you don't really like making videos and you don't really like engaging with folks on social media, that is perfectly fine. There is a strength within everybody and there's a weakness within everybody. And it's about understanding what is yours and embracing that. And completely embrace that, because I will be honest that as much as a lot of the things that we did this past summer became really viral across social media channels, a lot of it was not by design. I am the type of organizer and activist and social impact strategist that just likes to focus on the work and actually spend a lot of time in my head. And because I spend a lot of time in my head, that's why I need a team, right, who's able to be like, okay, this is what we should be doing. Like, these are the graphics and this is how we should think about different aspects of things. And so that's really important, because I had to start to learn, okay, what are my strengths and weaknesses and what is the best way for me to show up for this movement? And so I would definitely say that one piece of advice is to absolutely be intentional about that. Now that we kind of shifted to skills, I also want to talk about the very real reality within the digital divide that really is about self-care. Because most of us are on social media, whether or not we just use it as a way to engage with family, friends. We're great at social media. We're not really that great at social media. And beyond social media, just thinking about what does it mean to be in a technology/digital age, accessibility. So it is easy for folks to have access to you. I would say that is one of the biggest differences between maybe 50 years ago and 100 years ago versus where we are now. Everyone expects that they should have your time, that they should have your energy and everything in between. And because you're just a phone call away or a text message away or a DM away or a tweet away, right, that it should all just come straight to you. And what I will say is that you can't take care of the community without first taking care of yourself. And so be very intentional about what it looks like to set boundaries, about what it looks like to ensure that you are able to protect your energy, and also making sure that you are taking control of your own narrative. One of the biggest things that we saw this past summer was that photographers and reporters were coming out to the front lines and they were capturing images of us and images to sell first and foremost. But then there were some photographers that were out there who were photographers of the movement who just wanted to capture it for history. And so with that being said, a lot of the images that came out, it was really us portrayed in a very one-dimensional way. It was, with the megaphone in hand, screaming on a megaphone. You actually saw me in the video at so many different points on a megaphone. So you can clearly see that like Chelsea on a megaphone versus Chelsea having a conversation about activism are two very different versions of how I talk, of my mannerisms, because when I'm on the front lines, I'm channeling my ancestors. I'm being intentional about messaging, and I'm making sure that first and foremost, from a danger perspective, you always have to be hyper vigilant and you always have to be aware. And so there is this certain aura that you take on as a way to ensure that you are showing up in the way that you need to show up, right? But in that same way, you're not going to see me on a megaphone speaking to friends, right? There's also this other aspect of being just like any other 24-year-old who, listens to her favorite hip hop artist or likes to go out, etc. And so I think that multi-dimensionality aspect of it is oftentimes lost on social media in the digital age because people want to find a box to fit you in, right? Because things happen so quickly that it's what is the quickest way to define someone and to put them in a box so that when the cycle changes, it's easier for us to process and move on to the next one. And so I would challenge all of you to really break out of that and to make sure you are telling your own story. And so we reached out to so many different photographers within the movement and said like, hey, like we want to capture ourselves in a different light. We want to show that absolutely we can be on megaphones, but as Black women, we are multifaceted and we are not going to be labeled as the angry Black woman on the front lines. We are going to show that we are strategic, that we are able to carry a movement, and that carrying a movement isn't just about being on a megaphone, it's about everything else that happens before and after that. And so that is how we were able to control our message. And so now you'll see pictures of me of just looking like very pensive, right? Or a picture of me with like other Black women organizers in New York City, et cetera, as a way to show that solidarity and sisterhood. And so there's a lot of pieces that ended up going viral after that as a way to counter that narrative. And so all of that to say, I feel like I am approaching time and I've definitely covered a lot, but some of the biggest takeaways that I want to leave with you all this evening is the importance of organizing strategically, the importance of controlling your narrative in the digital age, and the importance of setting boundaries as a way to do so. I would also add, because this ties in particularly to the last series that we had talking about the history of MLK and how that ties into the present day, that there's actually a docuseries that's running on BT in partnership with CBS this month going into March that talks about the history of the civil rights movement, everything from Bloody Sunday to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and how that ties into Freedom March NYC and our work, as well as the work of so many organizers throughout this country today, and really just does a great way of paralleling and emphasizing a lot of things that I talk about. And so it's a 6-part series. I'm in 2 of the episodes. The first one is about the civil rights movement, and then the one that's towards the end that's about the death of George Floyd and the organizing that took place globally as a result of that. So definitely, if you want to see me talk more about this and perhaps more in depth, and also to see the dialogue across so many different viewpoints that really comes to light in the series, then I definitely recommend that. And I do believe it actually kicks off this week on BET. Again, I could be mistaken because these things just happen so much and I kind of lose track of everything that's happening Black History Month. But the name of it is Boiling Point. So if you need to find it, just type in Boiling Point on Google, Boiling Point BT, and I'm sure it'll pop up with all of the information. So yes, thank you. And I'll stop there because I'm sure there are some questions and I know we're going into the next segment of the talk.
Thank you so much. I don't know if you noticed, but I was like taking so many moments to like, get a sticky note and trying to write some stuff down. You dropped so many nuggets and things that we often need to be reminded of. Like in the midst of trying to shift the narrative, we get so caught up that we lose ourselves. And so I think that it's so important that you even talked about setting boundaries for ourselves to make sure that we're taken care of. I learned that my power strengthens when I help other people, but what good use is that if I'm running in on empty? But yeah, right now I will open the floor up to Ms. Shavers, who will also facilitate our Q&A session. So, but thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aaliyah. Hi, Ms. Miller. How are you doing today?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing good. We had some questions come in from your first presentation, so I want to start with those, and then I'll get into some questions that were submitted for tonight. So the first question that came in, who are some of the social activists or organizers that you watch or admire?
Ooh, that's a good question. So I'm guessing they have to be current day. But I like to do a mix because I feel like you just can't talk about that without talking about your ancestors. Okay. Right. So I would absolutely say that Tamika Mallory is someone present day who her leadership to me is definitely inspiring, especially her power as a Black woman, the ability to really overcome a lot of adversities. I would also say that the woman of New York City and the organizers within New York City that inspire me, there are so many. When we talk about what took place this past summer in New York City, Black women carried this movement. And it was a lot of young Black women. It was a lot of Black women who showed up in the face of. There were mothers who came out to organize, who brought their kids with them. And so to me, that's just so inspiring. And even in the video that I showed earlier, Nia White was in there and Naila Idari. And so the three of us and the work that we've been able to accomplish, I would also say that Nupal Kiazolu was like a sister to me. She was actually a part of the Louisville 87. And Nupal is like 20 years old and has done such incredible work in this movement. She inspires me. I would also take it back a little bit further and think about Black women leaders, right? Like Ida B. Wells, like Claudette Colvin, like so many, Rosa Parks, right? You can go on, Queen Annie of the Maroons, because I'm from Jamaica. So always tying in the diaspora. And so those are some of the folks that I think about. I think about, Shirley Chisholm. I think about Fannie Lou Hamer. I think about all of the ways in which Black women have historically been a part of this movement, perhaps been left out of such critical conversations in the history books. And so for me, it's always really important to exhume their names and exhume those narratives. I would also say, lastly, there's this project that I'm a part of with Color of Change, which is one of the leading organizations in the US that focuses on digital advocacy around racial justice. And they recently released a campaign called the Pedestal Project that talks about essentially a virtual reality where you're able to put racial justice leaders on statues that have been taken down of Confederate leaders. And so it's an augmented reality, it's an Instagram filter, and there are statues that are built. And so I was able to be a part of that project and an augmented statue created, as well as John Lewis and Alicia Garza, one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. And all of that to say that when we think about everything that's been happening around Confederate statues and the ways that organizers within this country have shown up for that, there's an organizer named Zai Bryant, who is incredible. She's also a young woman who has done incredible work. And the last person I would add, who's actually from Georgia, is Mary Pat Hector, who has worked with the National Action Network and now has worked with Until Freedom and does incredible work. So those were a lot of names that I dropped. Hopefully any of those resonate, and I definitely encourage everyone to look into all of them, and if not all of them, then at least one.
Right. I completely agree with you. The next question, let's see. What are your suggestions when handling or responding to negative, racist, and or abusive comments?
Oh my gosh, that is such a good question, because I think that out of all of the platforms that kind of amplify our voices, perhaps ending up on Facebook is always the most interesting, because Facebook is the hub for all things maybe troll related when it comes to racial justice work and content. I think that maybe it's bots. I'm not really sure. But what I would definitely say is that it's always important to ground yourself in the reason why you were doing this work in the first place, because a lot of people will tell you how you should be doing it. A lot of people will tell you not to do it, period. A lot of people will try to essentially discredit, right, your work and your impact. And especially being a young person in this movement, there are a lot of times where, you show up with the intention of making it very clear that you will not be silenced. And so I think it's so important to continue to have a very strong core of what you believe in and your values, so that even in the midst of what can feel like attacks, what can feel, whether they be verbal or otherwise, because also being in this movement, you never really know. It varies. But what I will say is to just always make sure that you are prioritizing your mental health and you are being intentional about your why.
That is so true. Prioritizing your health, making sure that you are in top shape is one of the main important things when doing anything. Absolutely. For that matter. So I completely understand where you're coming from, and mental health has been one of the major topics that has really affected our youth as in today. So I want to go into talking about. So it's funny you mentioned Facebook, because that leads into my next question. Are there any social media platforms that target digital activism and organizing, and do you have a site preference?
That's funny. So I have a site preference. So I guess maybe by default, I have a site preference because I am on Instagram. So, and that's kind of where my central advocacy work takes place, just because I'm a visual person. I enjoy being able to show that multi-dimensional aspect of engaging within a community. I really don't use Twitter, because I think that Twitter oftentimes feels like that trap of everyone is just trying to have that hotline. And for me, it's more than a quick take. It's really about thinking about what do I want to say. And even if my Instagram caption ends up being an entire 2 paragraphs, I am perfectly fine with that. And so those are my thoughts. But I would say that all platforms serve their purposes, and just be intentional about what it is that you are looking to do and the conversation that you are looking to engage in, and how you decide to position yourself in that dialogue. I know that a lot of times people do things because it's something that'll make them go viral, or sometimes they do things because, it's the quickest way to get attention. And I think that we all just have to remember that despite the pressures of being in a digital age, that we are more than social media. We are more than technology. Right before technology, we were humans. And so really grounding yourself in community. And for me, that's always been important. And so, all the platforms, I would say that Clubhouse has also been really interesting, and it's new, and it's an audio messaging app. And that's been a great way to see how folks have built community. So if anyone hasn't heard of Clubhouse, I definitely recommend checking it out. And I actually do have a few invites, and I'm not on Clubhouse as often, but if you message me on Instagram at the Chelsea Miller, I will share some Clubhouse invites with you all. So, yeah.
Okay. And my last question for tonight, will you share your thoughts on woke washing and how we can hold ourselves accountable?
With woke washing, which aspect are we talking about in the sense of, I think there's a lot of ways that woke washing shows up. What to me, that ultimately comes down to is performative activism. And what I mean by that is there's oftentimes two forms of performative activism. It comes on one front of people showing up in a way that essentially just makes them look like they're not complicit in a part of the problem, even though they are. And so they'd rather perform than really be intentional about what it looks like to think about how they can use their resources to show up to this movement. And then I would say another form of what we talk about when we think about this idea of washing out the narrative, I think about folks who are divisive within our activism space, right? And this idea of what does it mean when we say that we are woke, but we are not necessarily contributing and uplifting other activists, but rather tearing them down. And I think this also ties into, this phenomenon around cancel culture, right? And so I would say that there are two ways of seeing it. There's that performative activism and allyship, and there's this also very real reality that a lot of times we will see that people are torn down on social media and within community when there should be an opportunity to build within community. And so I would say that it looks very different, and it honestly depends on who you're asking. But my thoughts on it is that, again, center your message, know who you are, and don't allow other people to define what impact looks like for you and how you show up and how you create change.
Thank you so much. That was my last question. Your insights and your thoughts have really opened my eyes and have really helped me to find my voice and try to figure out, who I am, and not necessarily who I am, but what I can do to make a difference in someone else's life. So thank you so much for your time and the question.
Chelsea, I'm going to take advantage of the time. We actually have a few more minutes before we do an official wrap up. And so I have a question that certainly aligns with what Daisha just presented to you in terms of the whole woke washing. And that was, I had not heard that term until very recently. But will you speak to our audience, particularly those young people? And I'm just an advocate, and that I think that comes just with years of wisdom and being older, of being mindful of your post and how that can have a ripple effect. And so if you have then found yourself in the activism space and trying to make a difference, and whatever the rally cry is in terms of making a difference based upon the chosen and selective cause, also being mindful that that is how you are then seen. And not that we are one-dimensional individuals, we are certainly multidimensional, but that becomes a part of who you are and what you represent. So with that, you have to make some decisions. And so where you may traditionally post some things in the name of youth or having fun, those things will then follow you, and you don't want to diminish the cause or the effort. Would you speak to that before we wrap up?
Yeah, that is such a great question. Okay, so a lot of thoughts on that. So one of the biggest things that I say is that I try, and I don't, right? And our organization doesn't subscribe to respectability politics. And so it was really important for us that in a world that tries to police the bodies of Black women, that tries to define what we should look like and how we should speak, to show that multifaceted nature. But I would say that specifically within the movement and the importance of being very clear about who you are and not leaving much up for confusion. And what I mean by that is that it's important to show yourself in the most authentic version of yourself in a way that really allows you to control your own story. And so there have been times where folks would reach out to us and say, like, can we please get a story on Freedom March? Can we please get a story on, the impact and you all's sisterhood and et cetera. And the reason for that is because of something that they saw on social media. Perhaps it was a post, perhaps it was another article that we talked about the importance of community, that we talked about our values. And what you will find is that a lot of people are looking for that very thing. And so what I will say is to be intentional about building bridges that unite instead of language that divides, to understand when it is time to call people in versus when it is time to call people out, and understanding that there are so many different perspectives that oftentimes must be brought to the table, and you can still be unapologetic and authentic to yourself while at the same time not contributing to the same systems that ultimately oppress so many. And so for me, what that looks like is that our language of Freedom March is about being able to work together, is about being able to really build a better world, right? Is one of optimism. And so across all of our platforms, that's what we speak about, but we also do that with the utmost conviction, right? I think that that aspect of righteous indignation and good trouble, and that is what we lean on as we talk about our story and we talk about our work. I know that there have definitely been a lot of moments throughout this past summer of leaders within the racial justice movement who have gone viral for things that are not reflective of how other folks in the movement feel. And, you know, as a result of that, it really impacts the way that people see your leadership. And so for me, it's always important to not speak for other people, to emphasize the fact that, you know, I am one of many leaders, and that, you know, I am a Black woman first and foremost. And that's how I think about and understand my identity and how it ties into the work. So I hope that answered your question, but all of that to say, absolutely be intentional and absolutely make sure that you are thinking about not just today, but also tomorrow. And the reason why, when I initially posted that flyer for Freedom March NYC, that so many people came out, was because I was already doing so much organizing work in the community that people trusted me when I posted that flyer. And so I would also say this idea of trust and building that trust in community is really important, and showcasing that on your social media platforms.
Well, thank you on so many different fronts. One of the things I want to thank you for is that you've certainly shared your voice in the sense of giving young people, particularly young women, and in particular young Black women, the permission to be their authentic selves. You are, whatever room or circle you enter in, that is how you are then identified. But oftentimes we retreat. And again, it could be a number of reasons: peer pressure, societal pressures, the list is long. And so we want to enter the room. And so they're in our minds sometimes tell us that we have to be other than who we are, or other than who others, those individuals in the room see us to be. And so honing that skill and that ability to enter in as your authentic self is just absolutely critical, and is a contributor to your mental health that we talked about earlier. So thank you for mentioning that. As I have to echo Aaliyah, President Marion Ross Frederick, it's a huge initiative of hers. Daisha mentioned this earlier about mental health and wellness. And it is essential to our overall well-being. And as we started prior to even taping this evening and discussing this, we liken it to the air that we breathe, and that we need to sustenance in order to survive. So we need to eat. And so our mental state is also a critical part of our overall health. So the self-care, thank you for bringing that to our attention. I'm just honored to share this space with you, and that you, again, availed yourself to speak with our students and our expansive audience. This will go out to the greater Southwest Georgia community. They will have an opportunity to see this as well. And so you mentioned some remarkable women, and you certainly are in good company. Many of them that you mentioned are now in the ancestral realm. So the Fannie Lou Hamers, you certainly channel her, and Shirley Chisholm, and Ida B. Wells, I'm a huge fan of, and then you are still your authentic Chelsea Miller. And so thank you for all that you bring to the table and to this much needed continuance of social activism on so many different levels and different fronts. Just again, honored to have you, and of course, honored to share our beloved sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority incorporated together. But ladies, my some of my favorite women on this campus, Aaliyah, you did an outstanding job. So thank you for agreeing to serve as our moderator and our host. And Ms. Aisha Shavers, you know how I feel about you. You continue to do amazing work. And so thank you for leading the Q&A discussion. We will fittingly have Chelsea Miller come back in March, Women's History Month, and she will wrap up this amazing series that she started last month in January. Chelsea, continue to be safe. Know that we have already claimed you as an honorary RAM here at Albany State University. And so once COVID is done, we'll have to have you on campus and give you a great tour and showcase what we do so well here. So on behalf of our president, Marion Ross Frederick, thank you again for tonight's discussion, and we will see you in March.
Thank you, everyone, and see you in March.
Thank you.